Ahead, Madam.
Merci beaucoup. Thanks a lot, Mr. Chair, for organizing this very timely and insightful event, and it's absolutely my pleasure to be here. Dear members of the Parliament, dear participants of this public hearing, as we heard from Mr. Rugova, the personal story of a journalist, which speaks, I hope you can hear me, which speaks really about the state where the Georgian civil society is unfortunately today. And this is really staggering. The draconian legislation and the measures adopted by the Georgian Dream violate Georgians' human rights. Freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, as well as equality and non-discrimination. The rule of law is being dismantled in the country. Civil society is being curbed, as described by Mr. Rugova. Independent media, human rights defenders, experts, or any related service providers to the human rights are under pressure. Peaceful protesters are met with force. Participants to public debate are detained and imprisoned simply for exercising their freedom of expression. Political pluralism is targeted. Most of opposition leaders remain in prison. There is growing evidence of political persecution, torture, and inhumane acts. The judiciary is no longer independent, and free and fair trials do not exist currently in the country. So let us be very clear, and it's my job as an expert, as an independent expert, to be clear here. What we see in Georgia is no longer a democratic backsliding, it is a state capture. And this didn't happen overnight. Democratic backsliding and the growth of informal governance began already during the first term of the Georgian Dream government. It was gradual, but very, very systemic and steady. So over more than a decade, the government has dismantled the core pillars of democracy. And this slow erosion is what has brought us here to a captured state as we see Georgia today. And this trajectory is just fundamentally incompatible with the European path that Georgian people overwhelmingly has been choosing and are choosing today. And let's be precise, Georgia is not just the EU neighbor, it is a candidate country. So, which means that we are speaking about violation of the human rights in the candidate country of the European Union, and therefore the EU's enlargement policy is also at stake. Now, after all the political and financial investment that EU has been into the country, not only since the country became candidate country, but since the launch of the Eastern Partnership policy back in 2009, if a candidate country can dismantle democratic institutions like that, and the EU has no effective tools or strategy to steer it back onto the European path, then both the EU's neighborhood policies and the EU's enlargement policies risk losing their credibility, which basically having this in mind, I need to very briefly review what has been the EU's action to respond to the situation in Georgia very, very briefly. So, starting with the European Council that has taken an important step, Georgia's European integration has been de facto halted in the Council conclusions as of 2024. Negative conditionality has been implied. The financial support that was earmarked for Georgia has been frozen. And sanctions have been introduced against diplomatic passport holders and selected officials. And the latest enlargement reports have been very comprehensively providing the overview of the country. It says very clearly and very fairly that Georgia is the candidate country in the name only. So yes, I mean, the EU has acted. But the real question is, was this action enough? The real question is, has this action led meeting the objective? And let's also be clear, what is the objective of the EU's action, right, to address the situation in Georgia? If the objective was to steer back country on its European path, then the answer is clearly not, because country has not been back on its EU trajectory. It has been moving forward and farther away from conducting its homework as the candidate country and from upholding the European values that are the foundation for the EU accession. So what the EU has done so far has not changed the course of the country, neither the calculus of Tbilisi. And the question is why, right? Very first thing I want to mention is because EU has not targeting the person at the very center of the system, an oligarch who has amassed his fortune in Russia and who dictates political life in Georgia from behind the democratic facade. And we know what oligarchs respond to and what they're afraid of: sanctions. And this is where EU must go further and do more. It should impose targeted individual sanctions against this oligarch, his family members, and his circle. Georgian Dream officials, political actors, judges, law enforcement officials, and business figures responsible for state capture and democratic backsliding of the country. Democratic erosion and the state capture, as I said. If unanimity at the EU level is not possible, and I'm afraid we will not see unanimity, at least for one member state, which would not accept imposing sanctions on the Georgian government, then member states should move forward with coordinated bilateral sanctions. That is very much possible. Second, given the focus of today's hearing on human rights, and as suggested in the recent OSCE report, states parties to the Rome Statute should consider referring the situation in Georgia to the International Criminal Court in light of growing evidence of political persecution, torture, and other inhumane acts. Third, while we speak about negative conditionality, and it has been applied to the country and support has been frozen, support to civil society, independent media, and democratic actors must continue and increase. The European Commission has announced that part of the frozen funds would be redirected to civil society and free media, but so far the mechanisms to do this are not in place, and this must change. The EU has experience in Belarus and elsewhere in supporting societies under the conditions of state capture, and it must now use this experience to support the backbone of Georgia's democracy, which is civil society. And EU must do so quickly. I think we've been waiting enough. Fourth, the EU must continue to clearly distinguish between the government and the people. EU has been distinguishing between the two in the speeches, and it should continue. The Georgian people remain overwhelmingly pro-European. They're on the streets defending democratic values at the very high personal cost. We have seen the violence. We've just listened to Mr. Rogala. We have seen people beaten, detained, imprisoned, including journalists, like Mr. Rogala himself. And like Mzia Amaglobeli, who was awarded by Sakharov Prize last year, and including opposition leaders who up to date remain in prison, and students and peaceful protesters, citizens. As Mr. Rogala mentions, today citizens of Georgia do not feel safe in their own country. After all the sacrifices, the Georgian people do not deserve to be forgotten, and Georgia shall not be forgotten. Because after all, this is not just about Georgia. It's about upholding the values that the Union is built on. It's about the EU's enlargement vision. It's about EU's interests in the South Caucasus. And it would learn, if we could learn anything from extreme geopolitical tensions, it is that if the EU is not exporting democracy, European values and stability, it is importing instability and the chaos. And if we lose Georgia, that will be the next case. It already is the next case. In today's extremely turbulent world, with Russia's ongoing full-scale war in Ukraine entering now the 5th year, the EU cannot afford to lose Georgia to Russian influence. It cannot afford to have a captured, autocratic state on its doorstep. This is why the EU must do everything it can to steer Georgia back onto the European path. Otherwise, the measures taken so far look like an action of disengagement, like washing hands of Georgia, and that is not what the European Union stands for. Thank you very much.